As our son Ethan hurried through breakfast, the quiet hum of Nathan's electric razor from the bathroom blended with the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen. I stood by the window, holding a cup of coffee, and stared out into the backyard, feeling the weight of my own stillness. I told myself that this wasn't supposed to feel like this. It was a phase, a byproduct of 17 years of marriage and the daily grind of life. Our relationship had always been a quiet, steady flame in our 20s, not the sweeping, romantic kind of love that people wrote about, but the dependable warmth that makes a house a home. But lately that warmth felt dim. Nathan came out of the bathroom, dressed for work, his tie immaculate, and he nodded as usual. He looked at me with a slight smile, saying, "Bust a day today." His tone was casual and distant, and I mirrored his simplicity. He didn't press further, which he hardly ever did these days, and I lingered at the window as he left for the office. The office was bustling with its usual chaos, phones ringing, conversations humming, the distant tapping of phones, and the empty space he'd left behind. Ethan had already vanished upstairs, likely absorbed in his devices, and the house was silent once more. This kind of silence wasn't peaceful, but suffocating work had always been my escape at the firm. I wasn't a wife or mother. I was just Mia, a competent project manager with a knack for making things happen. It gave me a sense of identity that I sometimes struggled to find at home. I had become accustomed to the rhythm of keyboards, which was safe and predictable, but on this particular day, it was disturbed. "Good morning," Mia, Eric said as he passed my desk. His voice was commanding, and his presence was commanding. Eric was my boss, but he rarely seemed like one. He had a way of making everyone feel at ease, and I returned his greeting with a courteous smile, but it lasted longer than I had intended. There was something about Eric's easy confidence and the way he seemed genuinely interested in people that had always piqued my interest, but it was harmless the first time he lingered at my desk after a meeting. We were brainstorming solutions for a difficult project, and I valued his collaborative approach. However, as the weeks passed, our conversations veered first toward personal interests, then toward shared frustrations, and finally toward dreams that had long since been buried under the weight of adulthood. It was late at night, after the office had cleared out, that he asked a question that surprised me. "Mia, do you ever feel stuck?" The vulnerability in his tone made me hesitate for a second, wondering if I should lower my defenses, but something about the quiet sincerity of the moment made me answer honestly. "At times," I said, "it's like I'm moving through life on autopilot, and I don't know how to switch back to manual." His eyes softened, and he nodded as if he understood completely. "I believe that many people feel that way," he said. "We just don't talk about it." We didn't talk much after that. On the surface, though, everything felt normal when I left the office and went home. Nathan asked me about my day, and I smiled and nodded at the appropriate times as he told me about his new gadget. Later that night, as Nathan slept next to me, I stared at the ceiling, replaying Eric's question in my head. "Do you ever feel stuck?" I wanted to brush it off as a fleeting thought, a brief moment of connection between two coworkers. However, as I fell into a restless sleep, I couldn't help but wonder if there was a way to feel unstuck again, or if I even deserved it. The days following that first late-night conversation with Eric went by quickly, but I wasn't sure what had changed. On the surface, everything was the same: meetings, deadlines, family dinners, yet I felt lighter, as if a door had opened that I hadn't noticed before. At first, Eric's attention seemed professional. The details were different: an extra beat of eye contact during a team meeting where he lingered after everyone else had left compliments that felt less forced and more deliberate. "You handled that presentation brilliantly," he said once after I managed to pull off a last-minute proposal for a challenging client. It was nothing unusual, a colleague checking in to offer support brainstorming ideas for a difficult project. One morning, as I passed his office wearing a dress I had bought on a whim, Nathan didn't even notice it. I smiled politely, brushing it off, but later that day, when I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I found myself turning his words over in my head. The office emptied earlier than usual one evening, leaving just a few stragglers finishing up. I said this in a casual tone, but my stomach fluttered unexpectedly. Then, there were the times when he seemed to notice things about me that no one else did. Green suits you. I was finishing up emails when Eric's voice startled me. Burning the midnight oil once more, Mia. I looked up to see him leaning against the doorframe of his office, his tie loose, his sleeves rolled up, a rare sight for someone who is always perfectly put together. Someone needs to keep the lights on. I half joked, and he laughed, gesturing toward his office. I was about to open a bottle of wine to celebrate making it through this week. Would you mind joining me? His offer seemed innocuous at first glance, but something about his tone. It's just wine, he added, sensing my paw, and his assurance disarmed me. Before I could overthink it, I found myself following him into his office. The room felt different at night, quieter, and he poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to me before gesturing for me to sit on the couch to survive the chaos. I echoed his words, raising his glass to survival and grinning faintly as our glasses clinked. At first, our conversation stayed comfortably in the realm of work. Difficult clients, impending deadlines, and the typical office grousing, but as the minutes went by, things started to change. He asked me questions about myself as a person and as a colleague. What did you want to be when you were a kid? He asked in a curious, almost playful tone. I hadn't considered it in years, so I was surprised when I replied, an artist. His eyebrows raised in genuine interest, and I confessed that I used to spend hours with a sketch pad. Dreaming about going to Paris and studying at the Art Museum there, his eyes softened, and I said, what stopped you from living? With a shrug and a smile that was tinged with regret, responsibilities, and practicality. He didn't say anything, but instead watched me intensely, making me feel exposed but also seen in a way I hadn't seen in years. You should still go to Paris, he said, shaking my head and laughing lightly. His tone was serious, and his words hung in the air between us. He was leaning slowly and deliberately, giving me every opportunity to pull away, but I didn't. When his lips met mine, it was like a shock of electricity that ran through me. It wasn't just the kiss itself. It was the feelings it evoked, the excitement connection, the spark of something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about passion or lust. The kiss happened so quickly and unexpectedly that I didn't have time to process it until it was over. I'm sorry, he said softly, though his eyes told a different story. I should go, I whispered, my voice shaky as I stood. He didn't stop me as I left his office and walked into the empty parking lot. My heart pounded in my chest, the taste of the kiss still lingering on my lips, and guilt bubbled up, but it was overtaken by something far more dangerous, a desire to feel that way. When he pulled back, his expression was unreadable, a mixture of vulnerability and quiet confidence. Eric didn't bring up the kiss when I saw him at work the following morning. He greeted me with his typical warm smile, professional but tinged with familiarity, as though nothing had happened. I was both grateful and disappointed at the same time. In the days after that kiss, I told myself it was a mistake, a line crossed in a brief moment of weakness. I promised myself it wouldn't happen again, that I would refocus on my marriage, my family, and my life, but I learned that promises are brittle things when desire starts to take hold. Had hoped that he would address it and give voice to the unsaid tension between us, but another part of me, filled with guilt and self-blame, was relieved by his silence, but something had changed. It began small, first with Eric staying a little longer at my desk after meetings. His magnetic presence made the air feel charged, and he would find reasons to stop by, ostensibly to talk about work, but our conversations would always veer into the personal. One afternoon, he said, I found this article on Paris. He said, it's nothing, but the weight of his eyes told a different story. The first time we stayed late after work again, it was under the pretense of AL's impending deadline. I thought you might like it. I looked down at the article, a travel guide to hidden art galleries in the city. My heart ached as I glanced up at him. Thank you, I said, my voice softer than I intended. His eyes held mine, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. I could use another set of eyes on this proposal, Eric said. Nathan had been trying to organize a family dinner that evening, which was a rare gesture I didn't want to dismiss, but as Eric looked at me with an open and inviting expression, I found myself nodding yes. I then grabbed my laptop in his office, and the hours passed without anyone noticing as we worked side by side, reviewing spreadsheets, debating strategies, and fine-tuning the proposal's details. However, somewhere along the line, I have to admit, the conversation changed. Leaning back in his chair, Eric said, "You've made my life so much easier since you joined the team." I chuckled and shook my head, but I think you're giving me too much credit. He was serious. His tone was earnest. "You're sharp, creative, and reliable. It's rare to find someone who can handle pressure the way you do." The warmth of his praise made my cheeks flush. I looked down, fiddling with the edge of my notebook. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer. "Now you're remarkable, Mia. We're on mine," and the room seemed to suddenly shrink. The space between us seemed to hum with unsaid words, and for a brief moment, I thought he might lean in again, but he didn't. As the weeks passed, our late-night meetings increased in frequency, and we always had an excuse: a project deadline, a challenging client, a brainstorming session, but we both knew it wasn't just about work. Eric's charisma was captivating, and his confidence was intoxicating. He had a way of making me feel like the most important person in the room, like my thoughts and opinions mattered in a way that they hadn't for years at home. Nathan was making an effort in his own quiet way, noticing my distracted behavior and suggesting a weekend getaway, just the two of us. His eyes were hopeful, and I wanted to say yes so that he could pull me back into the orbit of our marriage, but the idea of spending a weekend acting like nothing was wrong felt stifling. I made excuses about work and Ethan's schedule, but Nathan couldn't find the time, and I despised myself for the lies for the growing. One evening after another long day, Eric and I were alone in his office, once more. The pretense of work had vanished, leaving us in the comfortable rhythm of conversation. "What do you want, Mia?" he asked abruptly in a low, serious voice. "What do you mean in life?" he clarified. "What do you want? Not what you have to do, not what's expected of you." I stared at him, the weight of the question pressing down on me. No one had asked me that in years. After I finally confessed, my voice was barely above a whisper, and Eric leaned forward, his eyes unblinking. "I think you do." His words hung in the air, daring me to face the truth I'd been avoiding, and before I could react, he reached out and touched me. The brief but electric contact sent a shiver down my spine, and the lines between us became increasingly hazy as each day went by. We stopped acting as though our relationship was solely professional, but we maintained the facing everyone else in private. Our time together became more intimate and intense. One night, as the office lights went down and the outside world seemed to fade, Eric leaned in again, and I didn't hesitate. This time, the kiss was slower and more purposeful, as if we were both enjoying the inevitable moment. When we pulled apart, I felt out of breath and my heart was racing. I whispered, "We can't keep doing this," but my resolve was already eroding. Eric's lips curled into a small knowing smile before telling me, "There's someone I think you should meet," Eric said, leaning back in his chair. I raised an eyebrow, and he smiled the kind of smile that always seemed to carry layers of meaning. "Victor is a brilliant guy from strategy, and I think you'd find him interesting." I tried to stop, but I couldn't. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Eric first mentioned Victor. We were wrapping up a meeting, the kind of routine discussion that had turned into a thinly veiled excuse to spend time together. 2 days later, in the break room, Eric introduced himself. His hand rested lightly on my shoulder as he said, "This is Victor." Mia looked up from his coffee cup, his dark eyes meeting mine with an intensity that surprised me. He wasn't like Eric, who was open and charming. Victor was reserved, his demeanor cool and deliberate. "It's nice to meet you," I said, offering a polite smile. "It's nice to meet you," he replied, his voice smooth and measured. At first, our interactions were brief and unremarkable, with nods of acknowledgement during meetings and brief exchanges in the hallway. However, Eric had a way of arranging things to bring people together in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, and before I knew it, the three of us were spending more time together. At first, it was under the guise of collaboration, such as suggesting working sessions that conveniently included Victor, framing them as opportunities to bring new perspectives to the table, but the dynamic was different. Victor's energy was more like gravity, steady and unavoidable. Victor didn't talk much, but when he did, his words were powerful. He had a sharp mind that demanded attention, and I was drawn to his quiet confidence. One evening, after a lengthy meeting that had turned into casual conversation, the three of us lingered in Eric's office. Eric said I could use a drink and stood up to get a bottle of. Victor's gaze rested on me more than once, his dark eyes searching as though he was peeling back layers I wasn't sure I wanted exposed. And Eric noticed. He always noticed Eric was the one who planted the seed. You know, he said one afternoon, his tone catchy. Victor nodded, and I hesitated only a moment before agreeing. The atmosphere changed as the bourbon flowed. The conversation shifted from work to life, drifting into the kind of territory that felt both intimate and dangerous. Victor and I started spending more time together outside of Eric's influence, starting with coffee breaks that lasted longer than they should have, and conversations that veered into very personal territory. His words, however, made me think that you and Victor make an interesting pair. I looked at him sharply, caught off guard, and asked, "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his smile enigmatic, but it wasn't just an observation. It was a suggestion, a purposeful nudge in a direction I hadn't thought of. Eric was all easy charm and calculated confidence, but Victor was raw and unfiltered. He challenged me in ways that were both exciting and unnerving, making me face aspects of myself that I had long since buried. One afternoon, he looked directly at me and said, "You're not happy." His directness made my breath catch. "What makes you say that?" he said, leaning back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "It's written all over you." I didn't have a response when Victor kissed me for the first time. Before I could reply, he leaned in and brushed my lips in a slow, deliberate kiss that left no room for doubt. Eric had left hours earlier, leaving the two of us alone in the quiet hum of the office, sitting side by side with papers spread out between us. When he turned to face me, his expression was unreadable. "I can't stop thinking about you." My heart pounded in my chest as I searched his face, unsure of what to say. When he pulled back, I felt breathless with the weight. I whispered, "This can't happen," but the words felt hollow even as I said them. Victor didn't argue, but he didn't need to, and the look in his eyes told me that he knew it wasn't the end. Eric noticed the change almost immediately, so he said, one evening, my tone was light, but his eyes were sharp. "What do you think of Victor's?" I wasn't sure how much to reveal, but his interesting smile and knowing glint in his eyes widened. "I thought you might think so." Eric's charm, Victor's intensity, and my own desires created a dynamic that was both thrilling and terrifying. One evening, while we were sitting together in his apartment, sharing a bottle of wine, Eric made the unthinkable proposal. "You don't have to choose, you know," he said in a low, deliberate voice. My breath caught as I looked at him, then at Victor, who was watching me with an unreadable expression. "What are you saying?" I asked, barely raising my voice above a whisper. The words hung in the air heavy with implication as I looked between the two of them, my heart thumping in my chest, and he leaned closer, his smile slow and deliberate. "Maybe you don't have to choose at all," he said. The descent into betrayal wasn't abrupt. Rather, it was a series of moments, each small enough to justify the last building until there was no turning back after that first night at Eric's apartment. When Eric invited me to dinner the very next time, the three of us had fallen into an unspoken rhythm. Eric was the initiator, always pushing boundaries with his easy charm and playful provocations. Victor was the steady presence, his quiet intensity grounding us even as it pulled me further into his orbit, and I had become something I had promised myself I wouldn't let happen again. The kiss with Victor had been one thing, a dangerous, exhilarating mistake, but what had followed had crossed a line I couldn't even admit existed. The air felt different that night at Eric's apartment. We had finished dinner hours earlier, but none of us had moved to leave the room, which was filled with the low hum of music, the clink of glasses, and the undercurrent of stolen moments that teetered on the edge of impropriety. At first, we kept things casual, with drinks after work dinners that lasted late into the night. But each encounter felt like a test, each glance, each touch, and each dare to see how far we could go. I sat between them on Eric's huge couch, which was too small to ignore how close their bodies were to one another. Victor poured me another glass of wine, his hand brushing mine as he handed it to me. Seeing that Eric was watching us, his expression was unreadable, but he asked, "Are you nervous?" Eric's tone was light, but his eyes were sharp, and I blinked in surprise. "No, why would I be?" Victor smiled, leaning back against the couch. The way Victor's fingers lingered on his glass, the way Eric's leg brushed against mine, the way he made the first move he always did, turning to me, his smile softening as he leaned in for the kiss, I closed my eyes, losing myself in the moment. The taste of him, the way his hands rested on my shoulders steadily but insistently when he pulled away, all of these things made me feel as though a living thing was pressing down on us. Victor leaned in and kissed me, but when he pulled away, my mind was racing and my body was shaking from the weight of what was happening. Eric broke the silence, whispering in a low, intimate voice, "You don't have to choose." I froze, my eyes darting between them, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Victor didn't say anything, but his expression was calm, almost expectant, as though he had been waiting for this moment. Eric repeated, "You don't have to choose." I turned to Victor, my breath catching as our eyes met, and his kiss was softer, slower, but no less intense. His hands rested on my waist, steadying me as I melted into him, and then I crossed the line I had spent weeks negotiating. His words felt like permission I hadn't asked for, but desperately wanted, and I let go. I kissed Eric first, my hands tangled in his hair as I pulled him closer. The kiss was urgent, reckless, and full of all the things I couldn't say aloud. When I got home that night, Nathan was already asleep, so I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and stared at him, unaware of the storm I had. I cheated on my husband not once, but twice, and it was so bad that he asked in a light tone, but his eyes were serious. I didn't answer because my mind was too clouded with guilt and excitement to form coherent thoughts. I should have felt shame, regret, or anything that would have made me stop, but all I felt was the overwhelming desire to do it all over again. Far messy, it wasn't just about what happened in Eric's living room. It was about every text I sent, every excuse I gave Nathan, and every time I stayed late at work when I didn't have to. It was about the life I was still leading, the facade I was desperately trying to maintain, and the one I was recklessly building with Eric. Unleashed. But deep down I knew better. The weeks after that night at Eric's apartment were a haze of stolen moments and quiet secrets. And Victor Eric's idea came one evening after yet another secret meeting. We were sitting in his apartment with the city lights glittering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, and Victor was there as usual. His quiet presence grounded the electric energy that Eric always seemed to bring. Before speaking, Eric swirled his glass of whiskey thoughtfully. "Have you ever thought about what it would be like to just leave?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His tone was serious, but his eyes were dancing with excitement. Your job, this city, your old life just started over. I stared at him, not sure if I should laugh or take him seriously. Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and he said, "You're not kidding." Eric's voice remained calm and steady, and his words were soft but persuasive. "Think about it, Mia. No more pretending, no more obligations, just freedom. You and I could build something new, something real." His words lingered in the air, intoxicating, and for a moment, would fade as soon as it arrived. But Victor's quiet conviction and Eric's persistence made the impossible seem possible. One night, Eric said in a low, convincing voice, "There are no more rules, no more expectations, just us." Victor nodded, adding in a pragmatic tone, "It's not as far-fetched as it seems. People do it all the time, reinvent themselves, walk away from what's holding them back." Their words started to take root, weaving themselves into the cracks of my discontent and painting a picture of a life free from the limitations that had held me back for so long, a life of adventure, passion, and a connection I never knew. Now, Eric said, his hand brushing mine, "Just think about it," and I did. The plan came together with such speed and accuracy that I was left speechless. Eric, with his innate charisma and leadership, handled the logistics, researching destinations, organizing travel, and mapping out a route that felt both exciting and terrifying. Victor Ever, the strategist, handled the financial details we'll need. To liquidate assets, he explained in a tone that was matter-of-fact. Nothing that can be traced cash is safest. Their reassurances were constant, their conviction unshakable. This is the life you deserve. One night, while we were sitting at the dinner table, Ethan was in his room, and for the first time it was just the two of us. Nathan noticed the change in me. How could he not? "You've been distracted lately," he said. "I've been busy," I said, avoiding his gaze as he pressed his tone more. As the days became weeks, the plan became more solidified. Eric booked plane tickets under false names. Victor arranged for a rental property in a remote location where we could disappear without a trace, and Eric said in a firm tone that would minimize the chances of anyone noticing Victor. I lied, and the word tasted bitter on my tongue. He didn't seem convinced, but he didn't push any further. Nathan had always trusted me, which made the weight of my deception nearly unbearable. The night before we were scheduled to depart, I stood in my bedroom and stared at the suitcase I had packed in secret. Nathan was asleep, his breathing steady and peaceful, and I watched him for a long time, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. They added that we would keep our communication to a minimum for the first few weeks, no phones, no emails, in order to create distance. Their confidence was infectious, and their vision of a new life was toxicating, and slowly I found myself agreeing to each small concession that pulled me further into their world. I left a note on the nightstand, my hands shaking as I placed it there, saying, "I'm sorry." It read, "Please tell Ethan I love him." Then, with one last look at the life I was leaving behind, I walked out the door, where Eric and Victor were waiting for me at the private airfield, their faces lit by light. I thought about Ethan, the life we had built, and the person I had been before Eric and Victor, but then I thought about the thrill of their touch, the promise of freedom, and the escape from the suffocating expectations that had defined my life for so long. The plane stood ready, with its engines humming softly. Victor asked, "Are you sure about this?" And I nodded, though my heart was pounding. Eric smiled and remained confident, and then let go as the plane rose into the night sky. Below me, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and dread as the world I had known shrank until it vanished completely. The sound of the PLS engines roaring was deafening, but it was nothing compared to the noise in my head as Eric and Victor were jubilant, and their laughter reverberated. I tried to join in their celebration by forcing a smile when Eric handed me a glass, but the weight in my chest made it difficult to breathe. I sipped the champagne mechanically, its fizz and sweetness doing nothing to ease the bitterness rising in my throat. "Here's to new beginnings," Eric said, his voice brimming with confidence, but Victor was quieter, and his eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he poured another round of champagne. Eric had rented a sprawling villa tucked away in the hills of a remote coastal town. The property was beautiful with whitewashed walls, sprawling terraces, and a view of the ocean that stretched endlessly into the horizon. Eric reveled in the novelty of it all, throwing himself into the details of our new life with his trademark energy. He added a softer but no less resolute tone, and I clinked my glass with theirs, creating a hollow and distant sound. Despite their differences, Eric and Victor had an unwavering confidence in the course we had chosen. They believed in the freedom they had promised me in the life we were creating together. Victor, as always, was more measured, focused on the practical aspects of setting up safe accounts, managing the diminishing cash reserves, and making sure we stayed under the radar. I found myself relying on him more than I had anticipated. Believe it or not, the first crack appeared late one night as I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. The villa was quiet except for the distant sound of the ocean, and Eric and Victor were in their rooms. I was alone for the first time in weeks, and my thoughts turned to Nathan. I imagined him waking up and discovering the note I had left, reading what I had written with increasing apprehension and fear. I pictured him calling my phone, his concern turning to heartbreak when he realized I wouldn't be returning, and then I imagined Ethan knocking on my bedroom. When the days turned into weeks, the cracks widened. Eric was still the same confident commanding, always ready with a plan or AIP, but his certainty began to feel suffocating his endless energy. Victor was the opposite, his quiet intensity now tinged with something I couldn't quite place. He asked me where I was, his voice laced with the unshakable belief that his mother wouldn't abandon him. The guilt was suffocating, an anchor pulling me deeper with every thought. One evening as we sat on the terrace watching the sunset, Eric turned to me with his usual grin. "You're awfully quiet tonight," he said, his tone light but probing. "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile. Victor, sitting on the other side of me, looked over his brow, furrowing slightly. "Are you?" he asked softly. Stay, yes, but there was a distance in his eyes, a withdrawal that left me feeling more alone than ever before. This is what we wanted, me, a freedom adventure, a life where we're truly alive. Don't forget that Victor didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. The guilt didn't just follow me around at night, it followed me everywhere. I would see mothers with their kids in town and feel a pang so sharp it left me breathless. "I was just tired," I said, but I hesitated, caught between their gazes. Finally, Eric reached for my hand. His grip was warm and reassuring. Curious about the way he used to refer to me as his partner in crime, I also thought of Nathan, the man I had spent 17 years creating a life with. Despite our flaws and the ways we had drifted, he had been a good man, and I had betrayed him in the worst way possible. One afternoon, as I stood on the terrace watching the waves crash against the shore, Victor joined me, not happy. His voice was quiet but firm, and I didn't respond. Instead, he pressed to come closer and talk to me. "I don't know who I am anymore." The turning point came on a quiet evening when Eric was out charming the locals as usual and Victor was absorbed in his work. I sat alone in the living room staring at the phone I wasn't supposed to use before I realized I was dialing Nathan's number. It rang 3 times before going to voicemail. My heart pounded as I listened. I confess that my voice was barely above a whisper. Victor sighed, his hand brushing mine. "You're still you just need time to adjust." As I lay awake that night, I realized that the freedom Eric and Victor had promised me wasn't actually freedom at all, but rather a cage, a prison of my own making made of lies and selfish desires. I wasn't sure if I could ever return, but as I stared out at the endless horizon, I wondered if I could live with it. I said, my voice shaking, "I don't know what to say. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please tell Ethan I love him."